This is the Influencer Inc. podcast, where you're going to learn to build your personal brand and your career in business through social media, public speaking, writing, and PR. I'm your host, Josh Steinley. I'm here with Adam Grant, author of 3 New York Times best-selling books, Give and Take, Originals, and Option B, which cumulatively have sold over 1 million copies and have been translated into 35 languages. Give and Take was named one of the best books of 2013 by Amazon, Apple, the Financial Times, and the Wall Street Journal, as well as one of Oprah's riveting reads and Harvard Business Review's Ideas That Shaped Management. Adam's TED Talks on original thinkers and givers and takers have been viewed 10 million times. Adam has been Wharton's top-rated professor for 6 straight years, and he has been recognized as one of the world's 25 most influential management thinkers and Fortune's 40 Under 40. He writes on work and psychology for the New York Times and has 2 million followers on social media. Adam, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Josh. Great to be here.
So glad we can make this work. And so we start this off with the same question for everybody, Adam, which is, what does the word influencer mean to you? It means different things to different people these days.
Yeah, I never know what to make of it. I guess an influencer is somebody who has influence over other people's thoughts and actions. I think that if I were to try to define it, sort of in the social media world where I think it's most often used, it tends to be somebody who not just has an audience of people, but has a passionate audience, right? Where people look to them for insight, for information, ideas. And I think that in that way, being an influencer at some level is pretty similar to being a thought leader.
Cool. Perfect. So tell us a little bit more about your journey. Today, you're a professor, you're a published author, you speak, you do all this stuff, but how did you get here? How did you get your start?
I have no idea. It feels like a series of choices that led me in a direction that I was not necessarily planning to go. So, I guess the big turning point was 2011. I got tenure at Wharton, and a couple weeks later, a colleague of mine, Barry Schwartz, reached out and said he was wondering if I was interested in working on his next book with him. He was going to write a book on incentives and motivation, and I was incredibly flattered. We had written a paper together, and I loved collaborating with him. I was a huge fan of his work on the paradox of choice, and I was about to say yes, and I happened to have a meeting with my undergrads who were in my research lab the next day. And I came in, and they asked me what was going on, and I said, I'm going to write this book with Barry Schwartz. And they all said, don't do it. And I asked them why, and they said, well, if you're going to write a book, you should actually write about your own ideas first, as opposed to working with somebody else on their ideas. And they wouldn't let me leave the lab until I promised that I would reconsider. And so I made a commitment to them that I would, I'd think more systematically about it. And the reason that I was excited to write a trade book in the first place was it was part of what hooked me on psychology as a topic and sort of led me down the path to becoming a professor. I read Bob Cialdini's book Influence when I was a freshman in college for a writing class, actually, that I was taking on social influence. And then it was assigned again for my introductory psychology class. I loved it so much that I read it a second time. And I read a bunch of other books like Flow by Mike Csikszentmihalyi. Malcolm Gladwell's book The Tipping Point came out pretty early when I was in college, and I loved that. And this felt like a chance to try to share ideas more broadly. So I ended up sitting down and writing what ultimately became Give and Take. And I thought that I was going to write that and then just go back to my job as I'd been doing it before. And then, it suddenly felt like these doors opened where I had a chance to share my ideas more broadly, through writing, through speaking. And I decided I wanted to keep doing that because, after all, what's the point of being a social scientist if your ideas aren't useful in the world?
So how surprised were you with the reception of Give and Take?
I was pretty taken aback. There were moments when I was writing it, especially when I was thinking, all right, I know my mom is going to read at least part of this. And, I have some other people, I have some former students who will probably dig in. But I had no idea if people were going to be interested in it or not. I was hopeful that it might draw some like readers who are passionate about generosity or who really love social science. But beyond that, I knew lots of people who had written books, and lots of people who had written really fascinating books that didn't manage to reach a wide audience. So I guess I came in not knowing what to expect, and it was a really pleasant surprise that it sort of captured the attention and the imagination of a broader group than I expected. And I think looking back, it was it could have very easily gone a different way, because the thing that I think made the most difference in launching Give and Take was a profile on my work in the New York Times Magazine that Susan Dominus wrote, and it was completely sort of chance that she ended up doing it, because the summer before, she'd been a journalist for I think about a quarter century at that time, and she decided that she wanted to write a profile on the career that she almost pursued, which was early on she'd considered organizational psychology, and a friend talked her out of it, saying it was like an evil Marxist thing to do to trick people into liking their jobs. And so she becomes a journalist instead, but she's always curious about what might have been. So she decides she's going to profile somebody who does this kind of work. She reaches out to a friend just to say, hey, do you know anybody in this world? A friend refers her to a colleague of mine, Wendy Smith. Wendy had worked in a lab that I was in when I was an undergrad. She was a grad student, and she said, hey, maybe you should talk to Adam Grant. And Susan reaches out, and she ends up writing this feature that that really gets the ideas on the map. And looking back, it very easily could not have happened, and I'm not sure anybody would have read the book without that.
Wow, what a cool story. So tell us a little bit about Option B. You wrote this with Sheryl Sandberg, COO of Facebook. How did that partnership come about?
So Give and Take came out a few weeks after Lean In, and pretty much everywhere I went, people were asking me about gender differences in my data. And I ended up speaking at an event that Sheryl was speaking at as well. And during the event, I was walking over to get lunch, and a guy stopped me and he said, hey, I read your book, and I'm wondering if you might want to come over for dinner with my family to talk about what you've learned and the values behind it. And I was like, sure, I love having dinner with strangers at their houses. Of course I'll come. And I didn't recognize the guy at the time, and then I looked him up later in the event, and it was Dave Goldberg, Sheryl's husband. And I ran into him a couple more times and finally took him up on the offer. And that was so much who Dave was. He was constantly sort of opening up his connections, his knowledge, in this case his home, to people he hardly knew. And I went over there for dinner, and it was very strange walking in, because their daughter, who was 5 at the time, asked me how my day was. And most adults don't even do that, right? So I was like, wow, this is unusual. And then their son started quoting from my book, and I only found out later that he didn't actually read it. Sheryl had just prepped him. But it was striking how much of an interest these two busy, influential people took in just a random person walking into their house. And after dinner, Sheryl started asking me about gender differences in my data, and she asked a bunch of questions that I'd never heard from any audiences. They were really thought provoking, and I didn't have answers to most of them. So I had a long flight back from San Francisco to Philly. I spent the flight reanalyzing a decade of my data, and I was horrified by what I found. That men and women, if you look at the time they spent helping others, women had to do a lot more helping in order to get the same performance review as an equally competent man who basically did nothing for other people. And then was speaking up when men brought ideas and suggestions to the table. They were rewarded and celebrated, and when women did it, they were either barely heard or they were judged as too aggressive. And so I sent the data to Sheryl, and I said, look, this is sort of right on point with what you wrote about in Lean In, and it's even worse than I had expected. If you want to use the data, feel free. And she said, you need to write about this. I was like, I'm tired of trying to write about women's issues as a man. People are always like, what are you talking about? You're not a woman. You've never been a woman. You have no credibility, like making these statements. And Sheryl said, well, I'm tired of writing about data and people saying you're not a social scientist. Like, what do you know about this evidence? And she said, we should write about this together. And so we started writing together. We wrote a series in the New York Times on women in work. And we became friends because, when you write with somebody, you either end up hating their guts or you end up becoming, much, much closer. And I ended up spending a lot of time with her and Dave. And then when Dave tragically passed away, we started a conversation about building resilience and how she could build it in her children, how she could build it in herself. And eventually there was so much demand for her, I guess, the wisdom that she shared in a Facebook post about, what she was learning about building resilience and, sort of facing adversity, that she said, we should really write about this for more people and, share what we've been learning through studying it together. And that was the genesis of Option B.
Wow. Another great story. So tell me about how you produce your work. Is it all solo? Do you have a team? I mean, you have research assistants. How do you get your publishing, writing work done?
Well, a lot of it depends on the project. So I'm a terrible delegator, which means that most of the time, I'm doing things that it would be perfectly sensible to have a team involved in. But I always feel like by the time I explain exactly what I'm trying to do, I could have just done it. And so, I guess there are roles that I've gotten more comfortable sort of, identifying ways that other people can contribute. But I've never liked the idea of bringing research assistants into a project where, they would just have a tiny piece of it, or, they would be like, I can't stand assigning people grunt work, right? When I was an undergrad, part of the reason I got so excited about research was I had a couple of professors I worked with who, gave me the autonomy and responsibility to sort of help lead a project from beginning to end. And so I've tried to make that happen in some places. So, in a book writing context, what I often have is I know the studies that I want to cover already because I've been reading them along the way. I've been conducting, some of them myself. What I'm often looking for are the stories that will bring the studies to life. And so, I'll usually then bring in a team of research assistants. We'll go through kind of the main points that we're looking for stories to illustrate that we already have evidence for. And then, they'll kind of hunt through history, through, different realms of work to find people who have lived them in the past, or, might be, kind of doing something interesting on that point right now. And this is kind of like playing journalist, which I'm not particularly good at. But I had an editor, Kevin Doughton, who gave me some great advice. He said, look, people are interested in two kinds of stories. One is they're interested in stories they don't know about people they already do know. So, if you think of when Gladwell wrote about Bill Gates and Outliers, how he sort of stumbled into access to a computer at a very early age, and how much luck and opportunity was involved in that story. That's really interesting because it's something that's a sort of, I guess, a hidden story of how somebody well known achieves success. And then the other thing to do is to tell a really interesting story about someone we don't know but should. So somebody who's not famous but should be ends up being a very interesting person to profile. And so we look for those kinds of stories, and then to give them real involvement on the back end. What we'll do then is we sit down as a research lab, and they read the chapter drafts that I've written, which are usually just torn apart by the group of students in the room, which is always a great way to lift my spirits that day. But what ends up happening is, in a typical, I guess now I've rewritten from scratch at least 2 chapters per book based on feedback from my students, and I've taken a bunch of other chapters in completely different directions, and it's really fun to have them involved from the very beginning to kind of identify the narratives to the very end. Like how do we best communicate these ideas? So that's, I guess, a little bit of a window into the process.
That's great. Very insightful. So one of the reasons I was interested in talking to you is because our audience is aspiring thought leaders and influencers, people who want to go write books and do public speaking. And so much of this involves networking with other people, working with other people. And your book, Give and Take, is all about these relationships. And I love your book because it emphasizes the role that giving has and how much more successful giving is than going for the take. But for these people who are just getting started, and a lot of them feel like, well, I haven't done anything, so I don't have anything to give, and I'm trying to network with these other people who seem to have everything. What can I give to these people? What are some of the tips that you would give based on your research, based on your book, for these people who are trying to get started as thought leaders and build up their profiles?
Well, I think the first thing to recognize is that everyone has something to give. It may be, you could think about reaching out to people whose work you've admired and offering to give them feedback on, whatever they're working on next. And there's nothing more isolating as an author than kind of working on something in your own head and having no idea if it's going to resonate with other people. And very often you end up building sort of a core group of trusted early readers. But I think it's always useful to get a pair of fresh eyes on something, especially somebody who's found your work interesting, but is willing to sort of critique it and tell you what they think is missing from it or how it could be enriched. And I think that's not an offer that everyone will obviously take you up on, but it's a reasonable thing to suggest. The second thing I would say is it's worth trying to figure out if there are ways that you can support sort of the dissemination of the thought leader's ideas. So very often when somebody sits down to write a book, their goal is to take a set of ideas that they believe in and try to share them as broadly as possible. And there are tons of barriers to doing that, right? There are way too many books coming out every single day. Obviously our attention is incredibly divided. And I think that, anything that you can do to say, all right, look, I'd love to share your ideas, with a group of people that I know or an audience that I have access to. I'd be interested in, writing a summary of, some of the practical takeaways from your work, or, capturing a few of the insights that didn't make it into your book. I think that's something that at least some authors and thought leaders are willing to take you up on, because that's what they're trying to accomplish in the first place. And then I guess the third thing I would think about is whether there's a way that you can try to give them access to ideas they hadn't considered before. So there's nothing that I dislike more when I get a cold email from someone who's kind of entering this world, who says, I know what book you should write next. And I'm like, yeah, thanks for knowing exactly what I'm interested in, and for having this incredible intuition about something I would be passionate enough about that I want to spend at least a year of my life writing about it, more years researching it and speaking about it, and having it maybe follow me around for longer than I intended. It's sort of presumptuous to assume that what someone should write a book on. And frankly, if it's such a great book idea, I think you should go and write that. Right? Why are you telling me to write it? I think that what's much more useful is to read somebody's work and just engage with it thoughtfully, and say, look, I read your work and it made me think about this one question that I would love to hear your take on. Or even to make it lower effort for the person. I read your work, and here was a thought that I had, and I just wanted to share it. No obligation to respond. I think that that kind of feedback can be thought provoking, and sometimes it will start a conversation. And if it doesn't, you've still made an effort to share hopefully some information that sort of sticks in the back of the person's mind, and maybe eventually they come back to it.
Great tips. So this next section, this is called the Favorite Five, rapid fire, quick answers. What's one of your favorite books?
I have so many, I can't answer that rapidly, but a favorite that I just read is The Power of Moments by the Heath brothers. It's a book about what makes those great experiences in life so memorable and transformative, and how we can create more of them for our employees, for our customers. It even left me thinking differently about how I want to plan our family vacations.
Interesting. Who's a favorite influencer of yours? Somebody you look up to and admire?
Susan Cain of Quiet, Dan Pink, new book When on the Science of Timing coming out.
Cool. What's a favorite conference, group, or event?
Oh, probably. Again, there's so many that I love, but one that particularly has had a big impact on me is the Work Human conference that Globoforce runs.
Cool. What's your preferred social network?
Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. It's a toss-up. I like them all for different reasons.
Uh-huh. And what's a tool, hardware, software, or website that you can't live without?
My laptop.
Yep. Good thing you got it right now because we're using it for this recording, right? So, all right. And where's the best place for people to learn more about you and what you're doing?
I guess adamgrant.net. The thing that I've enjoyed the most working on in the last few years is building this newsletter, Granted, where I try to share insights on work and psychology every month that I found to be fascinating on some level. And we've just started a wondering feature a few months ago where I take reader questions and then I weigh in on them from a social science standpoint and look at how organizations are approaching them. And it's been incredibly fun to get more reader questions coming in. And also, instead of answering emails one-off and saying like, here's my response to your thought, when somebody asks a question that's of broad interest, to have a chance then to share the response with a bigger group has been a total blast.
Uh-huh. Fun stuff. All right. So now for those of you who are watching this as part of Influence Summit 2017, just stay tuned. We're going to deep dive into a topic that Grant knows a lot about, which is academic research and the impact that's had on his influencer journey. If you're listening to this as part of our podcast, maybe you're listening to it a year or two in the future while you're out running, you're commuting or something, head on over to influencesummit.co.co. and you can get access to this exclusive interview that we're about to do with Adam. So stay tuned for that or head on over to the website. Adam, thank you so much for being with us on the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
That wraps things up for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening and join us over at influencerinc.co.